Imagine receiving the best of God's gifts: wealth, wisdom, power, success, only to squander it all and leave behind a legacy of chaos and decline. This is the tragic story of King Solomon. But it's more than just his story, it's Israel's story too. In the throes of a midlife crisis, Israel reaches the peak of her power, only to tumble into a decline that ends in the tragedy of exile. How can we find meaning and hope in our own midlife crises and declines? And how does God's faithfulness shine through, even when it feels like everything is falling apart? Shalom and welcome back to God's Story, Our Story, Catholics for Israel's online Bible course. I'm Dr. Andrei Villeneuve. In our last unit, we explored the rise of Israel's kingdom. First, the rise and fall of King Saul in 1 Samuel, and then the reign of King David in 2 Samuel. Through David, we saw how God fulfilled his second promise to Abraham, to make his name great, by transforming Israel into a royal dynasty. But when David sinned with Bathsheba, chaos entered his house and his personal life unraveled. Yet because David repented, God remained faithful to his promise to establish David's throne forever. Today we turn to David's son Solomon, the greatest king of Israel. Solomon built a legacy of extraordinary wisdom and the majestic temple in Jerusalem. Yet in his later years, Solomon turned away from God, violating the very laws meant to guide him as king. His choices set in motion a chain of events that would lead after his death to the fracture of his kingdom and the beginning of a long, painful decline, culminating in the collapse of the kingdom and exile of the nation. Even so, God's providence was at work, weaving his purposes through the chaos. How does God's faithfulness endure, even in the midst of failure and loss? And what can we learn about trusting him in times of decline? Before we begin, as always, please remember to like this video, subscribe to our channel, click the notification bell, and post your questions and comments below. From Solomon's reign to the divided kingdom, the first book of Kings. Setting and themes of the books of Kings. The setting is the period of world empires. It's the time when world empires rise up in the ancient Near East and will establish almost their total domination upon the nations subject to them. First, this is going to be the Assyrian Empire, and then later the Babylonian Empire. The perspective of the books of Kings is that of the Babylonian exile. We know that these books were written during the Babylonian exile because 2 Kings ends just after Israel has been taken into exile, and King Jehoiachin has just recently been released from prison. There are two perspectives of the exile represented in these books. The first is the human perspective. Israel's fortunes are dependent upon the relative strength of world empires. So to the human eye, it seems like Israel is completely at the mercy of these world empires, which are much stronger than the small Jewish nation. But the real perspective of these books is the divine perspective, according to which Israel's fortunes are dependent upon their covenant loyalty. God raises up world empires as his instruments. So as you can see on the slide, God is the one who truly determines Israel's destiny, depending upon whether they keep his covenant or not, and these world empires, as powerful as they may be, are just instruments in God's hands. This means that the whole book is driven by the theology of retribution. Recall that this is the principle according to which if Israel is faithful to the covenant, if they keep God's commandments, they will be blessed. But if they violate the covenant and disobey God's commandments, they will draw curses upon themselves. This is why throughout the book, every king is evaluated according to a regnal formula. So it goes something like this. King so-and-so reigned over Jerusalem for so many years, and he did what was good or what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And according to his reign and his leadership, this is going to lead to blessings or curses upon Israel. There's a bit of a chronological problem in these books. We do know with a certain degree of accuracy when each one of the kings reigned, but not quite exactly, and so it's give or take a decade or so. Why? Because some of these kings had co-reigns alongside their sons. So a certain king would have reigned part of the time with his son next to him, and so that's why it's a bit difficult to establish the exact years when they reigned. This is also the golden age of the prophets. In an age of chaos and decline, these prophets proclaim the word of God with faithfulness, often at considerable personal cost, and they will never tire of calling Israel back to covenantal faithfulness so that they may draw God's blessings and not his curses. Outline of 1 Kings. The book begins with the united monarchy under Solomon. First, the beginning of Solomon's reign, then the glory of Solomon's reign from chapters 3 to 10, and then in chapter 11, the tragic end of Solomon's reign. The second half of the book is focused on the divided kingdom. At first, there is enmity and sometimes war between Israel and Judah, and the book concludes with a period of peace between Israel and Judah. So we begin the first book of Kings. David is still alive, but he is old and cold. And so they find for him a woman who will keep him warm. This is Abishag the Shunammite. She's a type of nurse. She is not a concubine because the text does say explicitly that David did not know her. But in any case, she keeps him warm. And then the last challenge in David's life is one of his sons, Adoniah, the son of Haggith. Haggith was one of David's wives. And so his son from Haggith plots to seize power. Some of David's former close collaborators, such as Joab, the son of Zeruiah, who used to be David's general, and Abiathar the priest, follow Adoniah. And so it's a major crisis of succession just before the death of David. Fortunately, Nathan the prophet and Bathsheba, the wife of David, save the day. They inform David about this plot of Adoniah to seize power. And so David very publicly makes it clear that he is giving the throne to Solomon, the rightful heir to the throne. Solomon is anointed and crowned king, as he is anointed by Tzadok the priest and Nathan the prophet at the Gihon spring. And so David makes it abundantly clear at the end of his life that Solomon will be his successor. Adoniah at this point understands that he will not succeed, and so he hears of Solomon's crowning, fears for his life, and for the time being, Solomon extends clemency to Adoniah. So here are the words describing the anointing of King Solomon. And King David said, "Let Tzadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anoint Solomon king over Israel, and he shall come and sit on my throne, and he shall be king in my place." Then Tzadok the priest took a horn of oil from the tabernacle and anointed Solomon. And they blew the horn, and all the people said, "Long live King Solomon." So Solomon is the next king of Israel. This is the time of David's last days. He has some final words of exhortation to Solomon and instructions to Solomon to settle accounts after his death. And David, the great king, dies and is buried, and Solomon's reign begins. Immediately, Solomon moves on to consolidate his power, and this is prompted by Adoniah, who is still around, and he goes to Bathsheba and requests that Abishag the Shunammite, David's former nurse, be given to him as wife. Bathsheba appears before Solomon and makes that request before him, and unfortunately for Adoniah, Solomon interprets this as yet another attempt of Adoniah to seize the kingdom, and so he has Adoniah killed. This passage is very interesting because we see the mediation of the queen mother here in ancient Israel. So Adoniah, instead of going straight to Solomon, talks first to Bathsheba and asks Bathsheba to intercede before the king on his behalf. And as Bathsheba appears before Solomon, Solomon rises from his throne, bows down to his mother Bathsheba, and offers her a throne next to his. So it shows the power of the queen mother in ancient Israel, and this in many ways anticipates the power of the queen mother in the new covenant, how Mary is called to reign next to Jesus. So this passage very interesting in terms of anticipating Catholic theology. Solomon also settles accounts with others who were disloyal to him, such as Abiathar the priest and Joab, the former general of David's army. So Solomon dismisses Abiathar and has Joab killed, replacing them with Zadok the priest, who was more loyal, and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, who is going to be Solomon's next general. Solomon also forbids Shimei the son of Gera to leave Jerusalem. Recall, this is the guy who used to curse David and throw stones at him. And so Solomon forbids him to leave Jerusalem, but 3 years later he does leave Jerusalem to pursue some slaves that had escaped, and so this is going to lead to Solomon executing him. So Solomon settles all of these accounts at the beginning of his reign to consolidate his power. Solomon is of course renowned for his wisdom, but already at the beginning of his reign we see some alarming signs. First, he marries Pharaoh's daughter, and we know that this was forbidden in Israelite law, and we are also told that the people sacrificed at high places, these illegitimate sacrifices that were forbidden by the Torah. Still, at Gibeon, Solomon has a dream and prays a beautiful prayer for wisdom to the Lord, asking not for riches or power or control over his enemies, but asking for the wisdom to rule over God's people. It's a beautiful prayer, and the Lord's response is also very positive. The Lord says to him, because you have not asked for these worldly things and have asked for wisdom, I will not only give you what you have asked for, namely wisdom, but I will also give you a great reign that will be powerful, and also wealth and triumph over your enemies. Immediately in chapter 3, we see maybe the most famous example of Solomon's wisdom in action, when he judges between two harlots who come before him with one child, a baby that each harlot claims is her own. And in the midst of this dispute, Solomon famously says, cut the baby in two and give one half to each of the women. Obviously, the woman who is the true mother says, no, have mercy on the baby, give it to the other woman. And so Solomon knows that she is the true mother of the baby. So we see a really great example of wisdom in action here on the part of Solomon. 1 Kings chapter 4 describes Solomon's court, wealth, and wisdom. Judah and Israel were as many as the sand by the sea. They ate and drank and were happy. Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life, and he had peace on all sides round about him. And Judah and Israel dwelt in safety, from Dan even to Beersheba, every man under his vine and under his fig tree, all the days of Solomon. You can see the hyperbolic language in this text when we're told that Israel ate and drank and were happy, and every man was under his vine and under his fig tree all the days of Solomon. This is almost messianic language, pointing to the fact that Israel had arrived at this time of peace and prosperity and happiness, and where God really had fulfilled all of his promises going way back to the patriarchs, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and fulfilling everything he had promised to Moses and to the Israelites when he took them out of Egypt. The text continues, thus Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the men of the East and all the wisdom of Egypt, for he was wiser than all men, and his fame was in all the surrounding nations. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. And men of all nations, from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom, came to hear the wisdom of Solomon. So his wisdom was truly renowned, so that all people came to him. He spoke these 3,000 proverbs, many of which have been preserved in the book of Proverbs, and we have at least one of his 1,005 songs that has remained with us, namely the Song of Songs. Solomon's second major achievement is the building of the temple. In chapter 5, we are told about his pact with Hiram, the king of Tyre, up in the north, what is present-day Lebanon, where Hiram would provide wood to build the temple of the Lord. Chapters 6 and 7 describe the construction of the temple, the building of Solomon's palace, and the rest of the works of Hiram. You can see on the screen a very important verse, chapter 6, verse 1, that tells us, and it came to pass in the 480th year, after the children of Israel had come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord. This is a momentous event in Israel's history, and the chronology is marked according to another momentous event, the Exodus out of Egypt. And from this verse, we can know with some accuracy both the time of the building of the temple and the date of the Exodus from Egypt. It is fairly established that Solomon's reign began in 970 BC, and so the 4th year of his reign would have been 966 BC, and if we add 480 years to that, this brings up to 1446 BC as the commonly accepted date of the Exodus according to the scriptures. So following this mention of the chronology, the Lord promises that he will dwell in his house, again with the condition that Solomon and his successors remain faithful to the Lord. The text describes the construction of the sanctuary and then the furnishings of the temple, including the cherubim, the doors, the doorposts, and the time frame of this construction is significantly 7 years. So these 7 years reflect the 7 days of creation. What do we see here is that the temple is a type of new creation for Israel. Chapter 7 describes the construction of Solomon's palace, and then beginning in verse 13, we are told about the other works of Hiram, such as the pillars and capital, the molten sea, the stands of bronze, the bronze lavers, and then a summary of the work. So this is, in many ways, the climax of Old Testament salvation history, this construction of the temple. Here we can see Jerusalem at the time of Solomon. It was not very big, and so you can see the city here, which is the city of David. Here is the royal palace, and on top of this hill is the newly built Temple of Solomon. Significantly, this hill is also Mount Moriah, the place where Abraham was willing to offer up Isaac to God. And so a central place, possibly the central place in salvation history, the city of David, Zion, and the Temple Mount. So Solomon's temple is now going to replace the humble tabernacle. There it is. The temple replaces the tabernacle as permanent house of worship in Jerusalem. You can see in the sanctuary, the one lampstand and one table of showbread are now expanded to include 10 lampstands and 10 table of showbread. Here we have the altar of incense, and here is the veil that marks the entrance to the Holy of Holies. Here's another representation of Solomon's temple. You can see here, seen from the south, there is the city of David. The royal palace is over here, and there is the temple on Mount Moriah. Another illustration of the splendor of Solomon's temple. You can see the molten sea with the water that was used for the washing of the priests. Here is the altar of burnt offerings, and there is the sanctuary right behind it. The dedication of the temple is the culmination of this great moment in Israel's history. The Levites bring the Ark of the Covenant into the temple during the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles, in the 7th month, and the glory of the Lord fills the house just as it had filled the tabernacle at its inauguration in Exodus chapter 40. Solomon speaks to the assembly, recalling God's mercies to David, and Solomon prays a beautiful prayer of dedication, which recalls God's covenant and offers up the temple and its service to the Lord. Solomon then blesses the assembly, offering sacrifices, and this whole ceremony reflects the Deuteronomistic theology, anticipating sin and repentance. So there's an awareness that Israel is not perfect, that they will sin, but that God in his faithfulness will restore them thanks to his mercy that he has manifested to David. God then appears to Solomon, and we hear a renewal of the Davidic covenant that was formed in 2 Samuel chapter 7. So the Lord promises that he will not forsake his people, but he also warns his people not to forsake the Lord. Then in chapter 9, verses 10 to 28, we hear a description of Solomon's projects and fleet, once again underlining Solomon's wealth and power at this time. The temple will become a house of prayer for all nations, and so there's going to be a major shift here from the theology of Mount Sinai, which was designed to keep the nations out and protect Israel from pagan idolatry. But now the temple built by Solomon will have a certain openness for the nations, for the Gentiles to come and worship the Lord together with Israel. Here we can see a cutout of the sanctuary. You can see the high priest appearing before the Holy of Holies. And as we can see within the Holy of Holies, we have the Ark of the Covenant, the original small cherubim over the Ark of the Covenant, but now there were also two massive golden cherubim overshadowing the Ark of the Covenant. So what is this major shift going from Mount Sinai to Mount Zion? Well, at the heart of the Sinai covenant was a tent. The center of worship was a temporary shelter that could be moved with the nomadic tribes of Israel. Now, under the Zion covenant, the center of worship is a permanent structure, the temple, that draws all people to Jerusalem. The Sinai covenant was national. It was with Israel only, whereas the Zion covenant is international. The covenant now reaches to all nations through Israel. The Sinai covenant was exclusive. It was designed to keep the nations out, whereas the Zion covenant is inclusive, designed to invite the nations in. At the heart of the Sinai covenant was the Torah, a law designed to keep the Israelites separate from the nations. But at the heart of the Zion covenant is now wisdom literature, a new Torah designed to speak to all mankind. The primary sacrifice under the Sinai covenant was the sin offering. So that was the most important ceremony, an offering to atone for sins. Now, the Todah offering, the thanks offering, becomes the most important religious ceremony, the thank offering in thanksgiving for God's deliverance. So we see a major shift here from the Sinai covenant to the Zion covenant, which becomes more inclusive and more international. Now all the earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put in his heart. Most famously, we hear about the Queen of Sheba, who comes from Arabia to visit Solomon, and she is in awe and wonder at Solomon's wealth and wisdom that becomes truly an example and a model for all nations. So Solomon's fame and wealth are emphasized in this chapter 10. Somewhat ominously, if you look at chapter 10, verse 14, we are told that Solomon had how many talents of gold? He had 666 talents of gold. And so this number becomes very significant later in salvation history when it becomes the mark of the beast at the very end of the Bible in the book of Revelation. And so the fact that Solomon was so wealthy also is going to become a stumbling block for him. Here we see once again our triangle, and we see how God reveals himself to his people at the time of Solomon. We are going to hear about prophets speaking the word of God. The priests officiate in the temple liturgy, mediating God's life to the people of Israel, and the king is a ruler who is supposed to lead the way, showing Israel the way they are to live in submission to the word of truth of the prophets and to the life that is communicated through the liturgy in the temple. So the king is to rule in submission to the word of the prophets and to the priestly liturgy. Here we see the map of the kingdom of David and Solomon. As you can see, the purple area would be the smaller kingdom of Saul. The greatest expansion happened under King David. That would be the blue area. And then Solomon expanded still further to the north, taking over some parts of Syria. Over here in orange, you can see Phoenicia. And Hiram, the king of Tyre, came from just north of the kingdom of Israel. Seen from the bigger perspective, we can see the extent of Solomon's economic enterprises. And so Israel became the center of commerce with merchants coming through the Red Sea, coming from Arabia. Here you can see Sheba, which is modern-day Yemen, and also other traders that came from the Mediterranean. And so Israel truly became this significant kingdom in the ancient Near East. Unfortunately, we do know that Solomon's reign did not end well. Solomon violates the laws of the king that had been prescribed in Deuteronomy chapter 17. Solomon multiplies riches, silver and gold. He multiplies horses and chariots, which point to military might. And he also loves and multiplies many foreign women, having 700 wives and 300 concubines. And we know that the book of Deuteronomy specifically prohibited the king from multiplying silver and gold, horses, and wives. As a result of this, Solomon turns to foreign gods, largely due to the influence of his foreign wives. And this leads God to announce to Solomon that he will tear the kingdom away from him. And so despite all of this glory that was given to Solomon, he manages to mess things up so that he will lose the kingdom. Fortunately for him, because of David, his father, God announces that he will take the kingdom away from him only after his death. Still, God raises adversaries. In Hebrew, the word is Satan. So the Lord raises up Satans against Solomon through the rest of his life, including Hadad the Edomite and Rezon the son of Eliada. So that's going to cause problems at the end of Solomon's reign. We are in chapter 11 of 1 Kings, and a prophet called Achiah the Shilonite encounters on the way a certain Jeroboam the son of Nevat. And Achiah has a disturbing prophecy for Jeroboam. The Lord will tear the kingdom from Solomon and give 10 tribes to Jeroboam. Achiah has a new garment, so what he does, he takes off his garment, rips it up into 12 pieces, and gives 10 pieces to Jeroboam as a sign that 10 of the tribes will be given to him, with also some great promises for Jeroboam if he remains faithful to the Lord. Solomon dies at the end of chapter 11, and his successor is his own son, who is called Rehoboam. Unfortunately, because of Rehoboam's unrighteousness, this is the moment when the kingdom will be divided. Rehoboam is crowned king, but he increases the yoke of servitude upon Israel. We know that Solomon had a lot of slave labor among his own people, and so at this point, Jeroboam, who had escaped to Egypt, returns to Israel and appears before Rehoboam and asks him to lighten this workload upon the Israelites. Rehoboam takes counsel with old men who advise him to indeed lighten the load off his people, but then he foolishly follows the advice of young men who tell him to increase this burden of labor upon the Israelites. So Rehoboam has a defiant response to Jeroboam, and this is going to lead to the revolt of the northern tribes so that Jeroboam is crowned king of Israel in the north. You can see here on the map, all of the northern tribes of Israel secede from the south, where only Judah and Benjamin remain. And so from now on, we're going to see 2 kingdoms, the kingdom of Judah in the south and the kingdom of Israel in the north. Another prophet, Shemaiah, the man of God, prevents a civil war. Rehoboam in the south is just about to go to war against Jeroboam, so Shemaiah prevents this civil war. And unfortunately for Jeroboam in the north, despite the promises that were given to him, the first thing he does after beginning to reign over Israel, he erects 2 golden calves in Bethel and Dan. So Bethel here in the south and Dan way up here in the north of Israel. And he even has the chutzpah, the nerve to say, "These are your gods, O Israel, that took you out of Egypt," echoing the words of Aaron when the Israelites built the first golden calf at the time of the Exodus. So this is not a good start for Jeroboam, the first king of the northern kingdom of Israel. If you go to Tel Dan today in northern Israel, you can still see this altar of Jeroboam. There it is, partially reconstructed, and so it's a shameful legacy to the idolatry that took place in the northern kingdom of Israel, really a sign that things will not go well in this kingdom and they will not be faithful to God's covenant. So here again is the map. We see Judah in the south, which only includes the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, and the other 10 tribes have taken over the whole north of the country. From this point on, Israel and Judah will continue their histories separated from one another, often at war against one another. So on this complex chart, you can see the history of both kingdoms. On the top in yellow, you can see the kingdom of Israel and their various kings that will last until 722 BC, when they will be deported by the Assyrians. And on the bottom in green, you can see the kings of Judah that will last a little bit longer, about 150 years, until they too are deported by the Babylonians. In the middle, you can see the various prophets. These are the prophets that we read about in the books of Kings. And then later we read about the classical prophets. In red, those are the prophets to the nations, such as Jonah and Nahum. In yellow, you see the prophets to the northern kingdom of Israel, Hosea and Amos. And in green, you can see the prophets that prophesy to the southern kingdom of Judah. Here's another chart where you can see on the left the kings of Israel and on the right the kings of Judah. From now on, our slide is going to be divided into two columns so we can follow the kings of Israel on the left and the kings of Judah on the right. The legend is going to be as follows. A king marked in red is going to be a bad king, an evil king, whereas the kings marked in green are going to be good kings. As you're going to see, all kings on the left, all kings of Israel are bad, and so they're all going to be written in red, whereas in the south in Judah, we do see a few good kings. An X marks a violent death when the king was assassinated, and the slash is going to mark the end of a dynasty. Something else you're going to notice is that there's going to be many dynasties in the northern kingdom of Israel, but Judah will preserve the dynasty of David, and so we're going to see God's faithfulness here. Even despite all the sins of Judah, the Lord is going to remain faithful to his covenant with David and will preserve his dynasty until the exile. So we begin with this divided kingdom. As we saw, Jeroboam erected golden calves in Bethel and Dan, and this earns him immediately the condemnation of a man of God, a prophet, who prophesies concerning a future king called Josiah. This is going to be one of the greatest kings of Judah, who is going to destroy and desecrate this altar of idolatry that Jeroboam erected. Unfortunately for this man of God, he is killed by a lion because he himself disobeyed the Lord's command. And then Achiah, whom we have already met, he is the one who ripped up his garment into 12 pieces, as a prophecy of doom also upon the house of Jeroboam because of his unfaithfulness. The Lord had many promises for him, but he blew it right from the top. Jeroboam's son is sick, so what does Jeroboam do? He sends his wife to go find the prophet Achiah to try to get some oracle of healing for his son, but Achiah sees through all this, and so he prophesies the death of Jeroboam's son, who indeed dies. The text then switches to Rehoboam in the south, so we're going to see the text switching back and forth, going from Israel to Judah throughout the rest of 1 Kings and also 2 Kings. At the time of Rehoboam, Pharaoh Shishak has an expedition against Jerusalem, and so things are not going well either for the southern kingdom. Following the death of Rehoboam, his son Abiam reigns for 3 years, and he is also evil. Following these first bad kings of Judah, the next king is Asa, and he's going to be the first good king of Judah. He's going to reign for a long 41 years. He's going to remove idols from the land and will go to war against Baasha, the next king of Israel. Asa is even going to form an alliance with Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, against Israel. So we see this fratricidal war between the two kingdoms of Judah and Israel. So King Asa, a good king who destroys the idols and plays his part in bringing Judah back to God. Nadab in the northern kingdom of Israel, he is the son of Jeroboam, reigns only 2 years, and he is assassinated by Baasha. And that already marks the end of Jeroboam's line. So it's the end of the first dynasty in the northern kingdom. You can see the numbers here. This would be the first dynasty. And now we move on to the second dynasty established by Baasha. He's going to reign for 24 years and is going to go to war against Asa in the south. And he receives a prophecy from another man of God, Yehu, the son of Hanani. And this oracle says that God will destroy the house of Baasha because of his wickedness. And indeed, this happens. His son Elah reigns for only 2 years, and then he is assassinated by a certain Zimri. So already the second dynasty in Israel comes to an end. Zimri's dynasty is the shortest of all. He reigns for only 7 days. After killing Elah and the whole house of Baasha, he is besieged by his commander Omri in the city of Tirzah, and he dies as he burns down the king's house in Tirzah. So a very short reign of only 7 days, defeated by his general Omri. Now Omri is an important king of Israel. He's going to found a long-lasting dynasty. Omri reigns for 6 years in the capital city of Tirzah, but then he decides to move the capital to Samaria. And so he is the founder of Samaria, a city that will become very important throughout the rest of salvation history, including, of course, in the New Testament. So he reigns 6 years in Tirzah and then 6 years in Samaria, and he establishes a type of economic and political golden age. By that, we don't mean a spiritual or moral golden age, but he did provide stability to the northern kingdom of Israel for several generations, and so he had a fairly long-lasting dynasty. He was nevertheless not a good king, so as we said, all kings of Israel were evil, and his son is the infamous Ahab, who reigns for 22 years. He marries the arch-wicked Jezebel, this queen who stems from Sidon, from the northern kingdom of Phoenicia, and Ahab is remembered for his confrontations with the great prophet Elijah. Here we see the map of the two kingdoms at the time of Omri and the great Omride dynasty. And so here we can see Tirzah, the initial capital of the northern kingdom, and Omri is going to move this capital to Samaria. From this point on, the text shifts to the powerful ministry of Elijah. He appears out of the blue as nemesis to the wicked king Ahab and his wicked wife Jezebel. Elijah prophesies a drought, so we can see how powerful is his word. This indeed comes to pass, and so during this time he dwells by the brook Kerit. He meets a widow at Zarephath, and this widow is very poor. She's not even able to feed the prophet. So Elijah is going to perform miracles, multiplying flour and oil that's going to provide sustenance to this widow. So we see the mercy of God, who really takes care of the humble in the land, even at this time of the wicked reign of Ahab and Jezebel. The widow's son dies, and Elijah has the power to raise him back to life. So once again, God's power is truly working through this prophet. Most famously, Elijah confronts the 450 prophets of Baal. So we see this great confrontation on Mount Carmel, which is really a clash of the gods. So who is truly going to be God in Israel? Is it Baal and all the various Canaanite idols, or is it the Lord who reigns over Israel? So it's a fascinating text. Elijah taunts and mocks these prophets of Baal. He asks them to first offer their sacrifice. And so they prepare the altar, they cry out to Baal, nothing happens. Elijah then prepares his own sacrifice. He even pours water upon the altar to decrease the odds of the sacrifices burning. He calls to the Lord, and fire comes down from heaven and burns the sacrifices. So a powerful manifestation that the Lord is truly the one who reigns over Israel, even in this time of apostasy. Again, thanks to Elijah, the drought comes to an end, and so the Lord extends mercy according to the words of his prophet. But despite his great triumphs, Elijah is persecuted by Jezebel, so he has to flee towards the south. An angel provides food and water to him, and then he travels for 40 days back to Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai, where God had revealed himself to Moses and to the Israelites. Famously, this is where he hears the voice of the Lord, not in fire, not in earthquake, but in this still small voice. So it points to how important it is to listen to the voice of God in our conscience, even in times of apostasy and persecution. What does the Lord tell him? That Elijah is called to anoint Hazael as king of Syria. So the Lord commissions him to even raise up foreign kings. He is to raise up a certain man called Jehu, who's going to be the next king of Israel, and his own successor, Elisha, as prophet. At the end of chapter 19, we do encounter Elisha and his calling. Elisha, who is in the midst of plowing his field, Elijah calls him to become his disciple, who will continue the work of prophecy in these difficult times in Israel. Ahab's reign continues. God is still with his people despite their infidelity, and so they win victories against Ben-Hadad of Syria. And then we have the incident that is going to seal Ahab's fate. This is the incident of Naboth's vineyard. Naboth is a humble man up in the northern kingdom of Israel, and Ahab covets Naboth's vineyard. He wants to buy it from Naboth. Naboth refuses because it's his only possession, and so Jezebel takes the law into her own hands. She arranges for Naboth to be murdered so that Ahab next seizes the vineyard. Of course, this does not go unnoticed from the Lord's part, and so the Lord sends Elijah to prophesy against Ahab, and he announces that he will cut off the house of Ahab because of his wickedness. Surprisingly, Ahab actually repents after he receives this oracle, and this is going to postpone God's judgment upon Ahab's house. So we see that there is always hope, and whenever judgment is pronounced against the people of God, there is always this chance of repenting and of delaying or postponing God's judgment. So the Lord truly desires to bless his people, and whenever curses come upon them, it is through their own fault. Still, during Ahab's reign, Ahab makes an alliance with the king of Judah in the south, Jehoshaphat, who is a good king. Jehoshaphat visits Ahab, and they call upon the prophets to give them oracles about how their next military enterprise is going to go. Unfortunately, these are false prophets who tell Ahab what he wants to hear. Of course, Ahab wants to receive oracles of victory, and he sees through them that they're not quite sincere. He then calls another prophet called Micaiah, who tends to be a prophet of doom, and so Micaiah at first tells him, sure, go ahead and you're going to experience victory. Still, Ahab does not feel comfortable about this, so he presses Micaiah, and Micaiah says, indeed, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of the prophets, and indeed, Ahab, your doom is coming near. Ahab goes into battle. He even disguises himself so that he does not look like he is the king to try to avoid his fate. But unfortunately for him, he is struck and mortally wounded by a stray arrow coming from the Syrian camp. He dies and is buried in Samaria. So that's the end of this very wicked king of Israel. We return to our two columns, and now the text turns to Jehoshaphat, this great king of the southern kingdom of Judah. So following Asa, now we have Jehoshaphat, two very good kings. He is referred to as a good king, but he did not destroy all the high places, and he does make peace with the kings of Israel, as we just saw in his alliance with Ahab. The book ends by turning to Ahaziah, who is the son of Ahab. He reigns only for 2 years, and we are told that he did evil before the Lord and served Baal. And so that's the last king who is mentioned in the first book of Kings. So we see we are already in the 4th dynasty of the northern kingdom of Israel, this long-lasting dynasty of Omri. As we said, this is an economic and political golden age, but in the midst of this prosperity and relative stability, we can see that things are not well in the northern kingdom of Israel. Once again, here's our map. We can see the conflicts between Israel and Aram Damascus. So Aram, or Syria, is the main foe of Israel at this point in these various clashes with the kings of Aram. As we conclude the first book of Kings, we can see that a great power is rising up in the east, and this is the empire of Assyria, not to be confused with Syria. So Syria is based up here in Damascus, and now Assyria is rising up under Shalmaneser III. So far, they have not been a threat, but we will see them become the dominant threat to both kingdoms of Israel and Judah in the second book of Kings. So as we conclude this first book of Kings, we see how Solomon received truly the fullness of God's promises that he had made through the patriarchs and since the exodus out of Egypt. But because Solomon was unfaithful, this led to the division of the kingdom and this gradual decline that we find ourselves in at the end of 1 Kings. So we will see how all this will play out in 2 Kings and how God still remains faithful to his people, even in the midst of decline and infidelity on their part. I will see you next time. Shalom and God bless.